And there's something about the written word that's like, it's a pretty interesting thing to throw into the mix. I know when I first started it was kind of confusing, but then I got really good at it.
For 2,000 years, we believed we knew everything Jesus ever said. The Gospels were complete. The story was finished. But what if buried beneath ancient stone lay words that never made it into any Bible? And what if one Hollywood filmmaker, before his final chapter closes, is determined to bring these hidden truths to the world?
The Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible. The oldest copy of the Ethiopian Bible, which is full in terms of a Genesis to Revelation copy, is 14th century.
Stay with us to know about a discovery that could change everything you thought you knew. The discovery that broke a 2,000-year assumption. Mel Gibson changed cinema forever in 2004. His film, The Passion of the Christ, shocked audiences worldwide with its unflinching portrayal of the final hours of Jesus. Critics said nobody would watch a movie filmed entirely in Aramaic and Latin. Gibson invested $30 million of his own money when no studio would touch the project. And then, something remarkable happened. The film earned over $600 million worldwide. It became one of the highest-grossing independent films in history. But Gibson was never satisfied with just telling the story everyone already knew. He wanted more. He wanted to explore what the scriptures left unsaid. He wanted to venture into the spaces between the verses, the moments the Gospels point to, but never describe. And as it turns out, he was not alone in that quest. For centuries, scholars believed the teachings of Jesus were fully recorded and preserved through the canonical Gospels. The Church held that the New Testament contained all essential teachings. Early Christian leaders spent generations deciding which texts were authoritative and which were not. Councils met in ancient cities to debate and deliberate. The books we read today in churches around the world were considered the complete record. That was the assumption. That was what everyone believed. Generation after generation accepted this without question. Then something changed. Archaeologists working at a site tied to early Christian life made a discovery that would challenge 2,000 years of certainty. Beneath the floor of an ancient building, hidden under layers of earth and debris, they found a Greek inscription. It predated the Byzantine structures above it by centuries. The lettering was unmistakable. The context was clear. And here is what made everyone stop and pay attention. The inscription mentioned Jesus in a way that did not match any familiar gospel passage. When Mel Gibson learned of discoveries like this, his fascination deepened. He began working on a sequel to The Passion of the Christ titled The Resurrection of the Christ. His goal was to explore the 3 days between the crucifixion and resurrection, a period the Bible outlines but does not describe in detail. Gibson understood something that scholars were only beginning to accept. Not everything Jesus said or did was written down, and what remained unwritten might be just as important as what was. The ground, silent for centuries, was about to reveal words that did not match any known book, a site that refused to be forgotten. The excavation began with what seemed like routine work in a well-studied region of ancient Judea. Archaeologists had worked this land before. They knew what to expect. They had seen countless ruins and catalogued thousands of artifacts over the years. Above the dig site stood the remains of a 5th century Byzantine church. It had been documented and interpreted many times over the decades. Nothing new here, they thought, just another layer of history to catalogue and file away. But beneath the visible remains were deeper layers that told a different story entirely. First-century homes emerged from the soil, kitchens with cooking tools still in place, storage jars that once held wine and oil, everyday items showing the daily life of ordinary people who lived when Jesus walked the land. These were not temples or palaces built for kings and priests. These were the humble dwellings of fishermen, farmers and families struggling to survive under Roman occupation. The very kind of people who gathered on hillsides to hear Jesus speak. The very kind of people who followed him from town to town hoping for a word of comfort or a miracle of healing. The layers suggested a continuous occupation of the site spanning centuries. This was not a forgotten beginning, but a buried one. Someone had lived here when Jesus was alive. Someone had worshipped here after he was gone. And someone had kept memories alive here long before any formal church was built on the spot. Pottery and household items matched early Roman period traditions perfectly. Carbon dating confirmed what the artifacts suggested. This community had roots going back to the time of Christ himself. Perhaps some of these people had heard him speak in person. Perhaps they had touched his robe or shared bread at his table. Every shovel of dirt brought new revelations. Every fragment told part of a larger story that had been waiting patiently to be heard. As workers cleared the soil layer by layer with painstaking care, they found mosaic fragments scattered across what had once been a floor. At first, these seemed decorative, patterns and colors typical of the era, beautiful but not unusual. But one section stood out from the rest. It hinted not at decoration, but at writing. Letters began to appear as the dirt brushed away, and those letters formed words that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship. The archaeological team called in specialists from universities around the world, translators who could read ancient Greek, historians who specialized in early Christianity. Everyone wanted to see what lay beneath the dust. No one expected what came next. No one was prepared for what those ancient letters would reveal. Beneath the dust that hid ordinary floors were words that carried extraordinary meaning. The floor that carried a message. Once the mosaics were fully uncovered and carefully cleaned, scholars confirmed what they had suspected. The central section contained an inscription in ancient Greek. The language was unmistakable. The craftsmanship was remarkable. But the content was absolutely shocking. The inscription mentioned Jesus and the disciple Peter by name. But here is what made headlines around the world. The phrasing did not match any gospel text known today. Not the canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Not even the apocryphal texts that circulated outside official scripture for centuries. Not the Gospel of Thomas. Not the Gospel of Peter. Not any document that scholars had ever encountered. This was something entirely new, something that had been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. Unlike the stories or sermons preserved in Scripture, these words appeared to be practical instructions. They read like guidance given for daily life and spiritual practice. Possibly spoken by Jesus himself, but preserved uniquely in this location rather than spread through early manuscripts. The style suggested oral tradition at its purest. Words remembered and transmitted by word of mouth within the community, passed from parent to child around dinner tables, from teacher to student in quiet conversations, never written in a book, but never forgotten either. Scholars urged caution in their public statements. A single inscription cannot rewrite scripture, they said, and they were right to be careful. But what this discovery did prove was something equally profound. Early believers preserved teachings outside formal texts. Local memory could hold sayings that never entered the textual tradition. The words of Jesus lived in more places than the pages of the Bible. Mel Gibson has spoken about this very idea in interviews over the years. He described how his own faith journey led him to explore aspects of Jesus that go beyond what most people learn in Sunday school or hear in weekly sermons. In conversations with Joe Rogan and others, Gibson emphasized that Jesus' teachings on mercy and forgiveness were not just historical facts to be memorized. They were a roadmap for how to live, a guide that transformed his own struggle with addiction and personal failure into something meaningful. These words did not appear in ancient books because they were not written, but they survived where books could not. Before the Bible was complete. To understand why some teachings were lost while others survived, we need to travel back to the 1st century. Back to a time before Christianity had churches on every corner and cathedrals reaching toward the sky. Before there was a New Testament to study and memorize. Before anyone had decided which books were sacred and which were not. Before Christianity was even called Christianity. In those early decades after the crucifixion, Jesus' followers shared teachings in homes and small gatherings. They met in secret sometimes, fearing persecution from Roman authorities and religious leaders who saw them as troublemakers. There were no printing presses to mass-produce texts, no publishing houses to distribute manuscripts, no internet to spread information instantly around the world. Everything depended on memory and oral tradition. People learned by listening carefully, they remembered by repeating constantly, and they passed on what they knew by speaking it aloud to others who would do the same. Only later did letters like those written by the Apostle Paul begin to circulate among different communities scattered across the Roman Empire. These letters addressed specific problems and questions. They were not meant to be universal scripture at first. They were correspondence between a teacher and his students. And even later still did councils of church leaders meet to decide which writings would become canonical. The process took centuries of debate and disagreement. Some texts were included after heated argument, others were rejected and condemned, and still others simply faded from memory before anyone thought to preserve them in writing. In those early years, many words attributed to Jesus would have circulated informally, spoken and repeated in small groups, without ever being committed to scrolls or codices. When writing did happen, it focused on the major events and meanings of Jesus' life, the crucifixion that shook the world, the resurrection that changed everything, the miracles that proved his divine nature, the parables that taught essential truths about the kingdom of heaven. But not every single teaching or practical instruction shared in intimate gatherings made the cut. There simply was not room for everything. Think about it this way. If you spent 3 years following a teacher every single day, you would hear thousands of conversations, advice given in quiet moments by the fire, instructions for daily life whispered during long walks, words of encouragement during difficult times when hope seemed lost, corrections offered gently when mistakes were made. How much of that would make it into a formal biography written decades later? A fraction at best. A tiny sliver of the whole. Minute details may have slipped from written records, but stone does not forget easily. When silence became protection, history has not been kind to ancient texts. Libraries have burned in wars and accidents and acts of deliberate destruction. Scrolls have decayed in humid climates and collapsed storage facilities. Precious manuscripts have crumbled to dust in forgotten rooms where no one remembered to check on them. The Great Library of Alexandria, once the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, was lost forever. Countless documents were destroyed during wars and conquests when armies cared nothing for learning. Writings disappeared when civilizations fell, and nobody was left to preserve their knowledge for future generations. But while paper and parchment perished in flames and floods and the slow decay of centuries, something else endured beneath the surface of the earth. Mosaic floors remained intact under rubble and layers of accumulated soil. The inscription discovered by archaeologists had been sealed by building collapse centuries ago. Ironically, destruction became its salvation. When the roof fell and the walls crumbled, they created a protective shell around the ancient floor. Protected from decay and human intervention and the countless feet that would have worn it away, the carved stone letters waited in perfect silence. Unlike fragile papyrus that tears at a touch or vellum that rots in moisture, stone can survive conditions that destroy texts completely. It does not rot in humidity. It does not burn in fires. It does not crumble when exposed to air and sunlight. In this case, accidental burial served as the perfect protection mechanism. What was lost to the world above was preserved in the world below, hidden and safe and patient. The ancient message lay untouched for nearly 2,000 years beneath the feet of people who never knew it was there. It survived the fall of Rome and the chaos that followed. It survived the Crusades when armies marched across this very land. It survived world wars and modern development that destroyed countless other sites, until finally it met the tools of modern archaeology. Soft brushes and careful trowels removed the soil grain by grain. high-resolution cameras documented every inch of the surface, and translators began the painstaking work of understanding what had been found and what it meant for our understanding of early Christianity. A few carved letters were about to expand understanding of ancient faith traditions in ways nobody anticipated. Faith before formal scripture. What does this discovery mean for believers today? Does it challenge the Bible that billions hold sacred? Does it undermine the teachings of the Church that have guided Western civilization for centuries? These are the questions that immediately arose when news of the inscription spread through academic journals and eventually to the wider public. The answer, according to most scholars who have studied the find carefully, is actually reassuring rather than threatening. The inscription does not diminish canonical texts or suggest they are incomplete in any damaging way. Rather, it fills a historical gap between lived experience and written record. It shows us something we often forget in our modern world of instant publishing and digital storage. Early Christians lived their teachings before they wrote them down. Faith in the first century was not centered on books the way it often is today. It was centered on community and practice and living memory. Individuals learned by listening carefully to those who had heard Jesus speak. They remembered by repeating his words to each other constantly. They taught their children around tables where simple meals became sacred rituals. They helped their neighbors in ways that demonstrated the love Jesus preached, all without a single copy of what we now call the New Testament sitting on a shelf. The inscription echoes that lived faith in physical form. It is a tangible reminder that the early church was not a library filled with scrolls. It was a living and breathing community of people who kept Jesus' teachings alive through daily life and constant practice long before formal scripture existed to guide them. This perspective helps explain why Mel Gibson chose to explore the unrecorded moments of Jesus' life in his planned sequel. The 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection are mentioned in scripture but not described in any detail whatsoever. What happened during that time in the realm beyond death? Where did Jesus go when his body lay in the tomb? What did he experience in those mysterious hours? These questions have fascinated believers and scholars and mystics for centuries without producing definitive answers. For Gibson, the teachings of Jesus are not ancient history to be studied from a safe distance. They are a living guide that saved his life when nothing else could, and he wants to share that transformative power with the world before his own story reaches its final chapter. Even after scripture was compiled and canonized, voices like Gibson would seek to bring hidden aspects of Jesus' message into public view for new generations. Mel Gibson and the unspoken teachings. Mel Gibson is not a theologian with degrees from prestigious seminaries. He is not an archaeologist who has spent decades sifting through ancient ruins. He is a filmmaker with a complicated past and a passionate faith that has sustained him through incredible highs and devastating lows. But his influence on how millions of people around the world understand the story of Jesus cannot be denied or dismissed. In interviews over the years since that initial triumph, Gibson has spoken openly and often painfully about his own struggles. Addiction to alcohol that controlled his life for years. Broken relationships that left wreckage in their wake. Public controversies that nearly destroyed his career and reputation completely. Moments of shame that played out in tabloid headlines for the whole world to witness. Through all of it, through every failure and every attempt to rebuild, he has returned again and again to the teachings of Jesus. Specifically, the teachings on mercy and forgiveness that seem designed for someone exactly like him. His planned sequel, The Resurrection of the Christ, represents the culmination of this lifelong spiritual journey. By choosing to explore the 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection, Gibson implicitly acknowledges something profound that aligns perfectly with the archaeological discovery. Not all meaningful aspects of Jesus' life and teachings are fully recorded in existing texts. There are gaps in the narrative. There are silences where we wish there were words. There are moments that scripture points to but does not describe no matter how much we wish it did. Gibson is now in his late 60s. Time is no longer an unlimited resource. He has spoken about wanting to complete this project before his time runs out. For him, it is not just a film to add to his impressive filmography. It is a mission, a sacred calling, a chance to share what he believes are truths that have been overlooked or forgotten by a world that desperately needs them. Truths that could help others find the same redemption he found when he was lost and broken and without hope. What humanity has yet to uncover about the life and words of Jesus may change how we understand his message forever. Do discoveries like this deepen your understanding of history and faith, or leave you questioning what else may still be hidden? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how this revelation resonates with you.